To get things going, what's your assessment of where we are in the Canadian television system right now? What's working? What isn't? And that's where we'll start. So here we go.
Hi, my name is Denis McGrath. I'm a writer-producer. I'm actually working here in Vancouver. I'm actually from Toronto. I'm currently the co-executive producer of Continuum. I think that this is a great process, that the CRTC has opened up this process, and that though we're not the public part of it, that this is mainly focused on a populist response. I think that's good. I think that's well overdue. However, the big thing I think for everyone in this room that always seems missing when we see a CRTC proceeding is we have to understand and proceed from the truth of the Canadian television industry that sets it apart from everywhere else in the world. And that is that we are the only country in the world where another country's domestic television system is on the air with us at all times. Not some channels, not localized version of some channels, but if you look at the US networks, they are on all the time and have been since the inception of the system. Now, this is sort of like the astrological equivalent of a black hole, in the sense that it sucks all the gravity toward it. And it's caused us in our system to come up with a lot of workarounds that at some point have served some members of the system and have not served others particularly well. The biggest one that we came up with was this thing called simultaneous substitution. We all are familiar with what that is. Canadians maybe aren't. The kind of populist anger or populist feeling that the CRTC might be hearing are from a bunch of people that think they should be able to watch US TV all the time. And I'm not here to argue that they should or they shouldn't today. That's the way it is. But that's how we work. And what that means is often people get up before the CRTC, a lot of the concerned parties, and they talk about, market-based solutions and the need for not regulation. And what that really means is preserve our regulation and just get rid of the other guy's regulation. And we have to recognize, whatever the framing of this discussion going forward, the idea of a broadcast regulator that only is going to push down some of the barriers and not all of the barriers is not workable. We don't have a market-based system. So from a content provider point of view, the big thing that we have to overcome is the disincentivization of a lot of the players in our industry to offer homegrown stuff. As compared to, for instance, cable channels or, in the United States, you see, starting with AMC a couple of years ago, every channel in the United States right now is scrambling to do what? To try to find their one signature program that nobody else has so they can differentiate themselves. That is the natural process that's going on in the States, where it is a little more free-for-all. Here in Canada, because we have things like substitution and all the other sort of stuff, we have an industry that's much more focused towards what US content can we rent and how can we use Canadian content to plug the holes. And most of the problems from our point of view as creators come from that. That being said, where are we today? Under a lot of pressure and under a lot of downward pressure, we're actually doing much better and we're doing really well. Canadians are watching Canadian programs at levels they have not for years. As a bit of context, does anybody know what a bestseller in Canada is? 5,000 units. A diamond-selling recording is now 800,000 units. And what's interesting about that is they reduced it from 1 million because of what happened in the music industry. Paid downloads are 80,000 units. We regularly have 1 million Canadians watching Canadian television programs, even on the CBC. Murdoch's doing over 1 million. Mercer's doing over 1 million. The Listener, they boot that everywhere around the schedule. They try to kill it as much as they can, and nobody will stop watching The Listener. Flashpoint, Corner Gas. We had a wonderful milestone this last summer where, the only place we tend to show Canadian programs, part of that distorting effect, is in the summer. We had 4 Canadian programs in the top 30, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually unprecedented and hasn't happened for years. So with everything that we have allied against us, we have Canadians seeking out and consuming our content at levels that have never been seen before. And in fact, properly promoted, most Canadian shows, if they do promote them, they will reach that million level on their premiere and broadcast channels in Canada. Now, they don't always stay, and that's the problem that we've got to solve in terms of our content. But when it comes to the CRTC and lots of people who stand up there and contextualize and tell you, well, the secret is that, we need to have to be able to be flexible and produce less. Remember, there is a black hole at the center of the system, and every discussion has to be framed by the fact that we are living and we are working in the shadow of that black hole.
Next.
I just summed it up. I summed it up exactly.
Introduce yourself, please.
Oh, sorry.
Yep.
Garry Chalk. I'm an actor. But it sums it up. I mean, we see this all the time where even my big problem is the Canadian or the U.S. reality shows that clutter up the network and all the networks. And because of our small population, it's hard for us to generate, as you say, the numbers. But when you take it in context to the numbers of the population of the United States and the numbers, we have better viewership of Canadian programming. It's good Canadian programming, and some of the programs that he cited, there is an opportunity for us to expand on that and make more Canadian content. My big pet peeve with Canadian content is the rules about Canadian content, what it has to be, what it has to contain. I think if we had a more flexible rules as far as because a lot of our shows are supported or subsidized by Telefilm and so on, that if we relax those rules and made the programming more universal, to go across all cultures, or at least in the English-speaking world anyway, that we could generate the money to produce those shows in Canada and make quality shows, and fulfill that that CanCon mandate. A lot better than just, as I say, cluttering up the airwaves with a lot of assembly line U.S. stuff.
Garry, when you say relax the rules, can
Well,
you think of an
there's-
example of something that you would point
Well,
to?
things like rules about location. If you mention if you make a Canadian show, but it's the location's in a U.S. place, for example, it's not Canadian content. It doesn't qualify. Or if you have an American actor, if you have an American producer, or like with Canadian music, it doesn't qualify. And because the financing models have changed so much and have become so stringent lately, the only way that we can get a lot of programming on the air is to do it with government funding. And I'll cite an example as Blackstone, which is an APTN show. I mean, it's a tremendous show. It's tremendous drama and great performances, but it's hard to get financing for that show because it's not sellable in other countries. But they're they have certain restrictions, like First Nations have to be, all the characters who are playing First Nation have to be First Nations. It has to be here. It has to be this. I'm not up on all the specifics, but I know that the rules for funding are quite stringent.
Now, if, for example, I was 25 years old, and I was once, and I was sitting down for a cup of coffee with you, and I said, Garry, I've been going to acting classes. I've been in acting school. I really want to pursue an acting career here in Vancouver. What advice do you have for me? What's my life going to be like as an actor working here on the West Coast?
Well, you're asking me?
I'm asking you.
Oh my God.
Okay,
Okay, here we go. My advice is, work on your American accent.
Yeah.
That's first and foremost. Develop that style. Resign yourself to the fact that you're going to be working mostly on American programming. You're not going to be, and because of that, the chances that you are going to get a starring or a leading role in that program is going to be slim and none. But it does happen, and it has happened especially lately, it's happened quite regularly. But that's what I would say. If you're going to do Canadian shows, you're going to go to Toronto, or you're going to go to Montreal if you want to pursue that side of it. But if you want to be a part of the American film industry, then stay in Vancouver.
Who are you?
Yes, Catherine Winkler. I have a digital service and content company called Switch United. And for me, it comes to really where the definition of TV is, because for us, it goes into non-traditional areas as well. So for the CRTC, I think one of the big issues is going to be, the broadcasters working within regulatory environments have to compete against now dishing out the Googles and the Netflixes and things like that. So finding new economic the economic reality of producing content in a really shifting environment is going to be what affects our business. So looking to see how the CRT is going to redefine what is broadcast and how to deal with the non-traditionals and the regulations.
And so coming from your place, from your perspective, what are some of the key challenges that you're running into in that regard?
Well,
And again,
certainly accessing all the funding mechanisms, and in the States, we're lucky enough, we have great funding mechanisms here in CMF and Bell Fund, but they're tied to mostly traditional TV. There's now been opening into interactive series and things like that, but it's going to be where's the money coming from and how does it work? Is it, if you've got micro audiences in a mass consumption world, I think Jean-Pierre Blaise called it micro-consumption in a mass market or something. So how do we deal with that? Because that's how our audiences are getting content. So to my mind, it's starting to find ways to identify those audiences and finding economic systems that will help us serve those audiences and show that it can be profitable to serve on the long tail.
And when you think of your audience, who is it? Is your audience a national audience, an international audience, both?
Well, both. Right now, we will do a lot of service work with great producers doing national television shows. So we're working with Omni, we work with Ice Pilots, we're working with Paperny and Force 4. We work with a lot of the nationals. So we're really aware of the problems they're having as well, but we're looking at more and more, we're being consulted by non-traditional broadcasters as well. And so it's, and they access funds in a different way. So I think it's trying to figure out what this landscape looks like, where you have a lot of regulation on the broadcasters, but then there's the non-regulatory broadcast as well. So how will that shake out, and how is the CRTC going to even the field for the broadcasters versus non-traditional?
Moyra, and then, yeah.
I'm Moyra Rodgers. I've been a television producer for 20 years. I've got a TV company called Out to Sea Entertainment, and in the last, 5 or 6 years, I've been immersed in a new company called Magnify Digital that focuses on online content and online content marketing, if we can use that dirty word, building audiences online. And yeah, I completely, I hear the conversation about the black hole, but I do hope, and I'm encouraged by what I've heard from Jean-Pierre Blaise, that the conversation and the role of the CRTC is going to be expanded, because further what Catherine was saying, that's only one side of the business now, that traditional model, and I hope that we see from the CRTC some very strong leadership in how we can stimulate growth in content delivery across the internet and in less traditional ways. And that's going to take a concerted effort, because traditional funding, understandably so, is triggered by a television broadcast license, because it's, that money often comes from cable funders. But we've got to find new ways, because we're seeing that the traditional television scenario in Canada, which is by definition, because we sleep beside the elephant, is under tremendous pressure. It's under even more pressure now because we've got a huge paradigm shift in the industry with eyeballs moving, as we know. And, you know, Business Insider just a couple of weeks ago reported that television's had its worst, in North America's had its worst year ever. And though some say, well, look, advertising dollars are up. In fact, advertising dollars are up because of high rates for live tentpole events, but that's masking the fact that advertising dollars for the rest of the television landscape are moving away. So I'd like to see some leadership on the part of the CRTC as to how we can stimulate growth and success in non-traditional business models. And that's someone's got to show some leadership with the funders, can bridge the gap between the funders and the broadcasters and the regulation to say, here's what a new model can look like, or new models can look like.
And your name is?
Oh, my name's Joel Reimer. I'm a producer coming out of Vancouver Film School. So just to add sort of to that, over the last 2 years, we've seen a tremendous change in television. This year, I've read in the last week and a half probably about a dozen articles declaring television dead. We saw an evolution from bunny ears to cable, and now we're going digital portal. We see Xbox TV, Nintendo TV, Sony Vita TV, Apple TV, Samsung Smart TV. We have the CW channel popping up as an application on those TVs. We have networks. Fox said they doubled Sleepy Hollow's numbers in 1 week on their digital portal. We're seeing an evolution where digital portals are replacing cable television. We're seeing people flocking to their smartphones to open up the CW app and watch the CW shows on the CW app instead of turning on their TVs to switch to the CW show. So the way television is moving today and dropping of cable networks as people switch to their internet services to watch on digital portals, I think it's extremely important that the CRTC address this change in landscape, because at the moment they aren't regulating the digital portals. And as we see Netflix creating original content, Microsoft announced they're making like 12, 13 television series that are going to run weekly, just like other TV series over their digital portals. We're going to slowly see Canadian content lose more and more advantages in a global space where global content is now available on your devices at any time. And it's not just online, it's not just Netflix, it's not just Vudu, it's not just Hulu. We're entering a period of time where these digital portals are becoming content creators, and they're beginning to edge out television. And the only way for Canadian content to remain competitive is if the CRTC adapts to the changing environment.
Over here, and we'll come back. Yeah, please.
My name's Heather Hawthorn-Doyle. I'm a director and producer of, we'll call it semi-scripted, factual entertainment, anything from documentaries to realities, and do a little bit of work in the scripted realm as well. Just to riff off of all of that, it really is a matter of, I still say I work on television shows, but I don't really. I work on lots of different types of shows, and it is about being content producers, and it is about the CRTC trying to make sure that Canadians are still protected in a content production sense, so that regardless of what screen it comes off of, that we are protected. And I for sure think that we have to be as Canadians because of the big boot, the programming of which I too enjoy, but because of the big boot down there, we need to make sure that the Canadian voices and the Canadian stories can be heard. And so because of that, I think it is important that you start thinking of it, and the CRTC starts thinking of it as content and how to regulate Canadian content on the various portals. Because I've been contacted by YouTube to produce some stuff for them and have monetary compensation for it, and no talk about Canadian or it has to be Canadian or any of that. And so for us to stay distinct and to make sure that our stories can be heard, I think it's important that the CRTC has to take a look at all of that.
Jamie.
Me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. If I could just amplify a little bit of Moyra and what people were saying about a very, very long time ago, to date myself here a little bit, but we're talking the early 90s, I worked on a show called Media Television. It was produced out of City TV. That's back when we called the internet the information superhighway. And every third show, we had somebody declaring TV dead. TV has been dying for a very long time, and the old girl just won't give up the ghost. But where the problem exists and where the challenge exists for the CRTC is cutting through a lot of the baffle gab to get to a position of leadership, because there is all kind of content. I think everybody in this room knows that it's very likely that 10 years out, we won't be making our product for traditional TV networks. But as it exists now, if you go online, if you see what that conversation is through the portals, what people are accessing, they are accessing, for the most part, and talking about, for the most part, big programs being made by old media. That's where the conversation is happening. And that is where the forces and economic forces align to get the great budgets to deliver good content. The little web show is nice, and it's great, and it will certainly grow, but that's not what's driving it. So this idea that there are silos between broadcast networks and BDUs and stuff is insane. It's just not realistic. And every time we get into a conversation like this, and the thing I would caution the CRTC against, if we go back to the group licensing a few years ago, there was lots of stuff to talk about. And what do we hear about? Stop the TV tax versus blah, 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 blah. What the cables and the broadcasters fought over. That is not the issue. But there are no silos, and the reason why we know there are no silos is because in the last 5 years, BDUs have bought half the broadcasters. It is the same pile of money. So to say that one side of the pile of money has to be regulated and has to pay into the CMF and has to contribute to the Canadian broadcast system, and the other pile of money that runs ads saying stream TV on your phone doesn't have to pay into it is crazy. It's a crazy model, again, that doesn't work. How does the CRTC encourage incentivization? I don't know, but it has to realize that it's all one big pile of money, and you can't hide these things off. If Canadian broadcast networks are not going to make original programs, we already get the US networks. We might as well just get those. If Canadian BDUs have no responsibility to pay into the system, then fine, then let's get our internet from Time Warner Cable. Let's get our internet from NBC Universal, because what's the difference?
In your opening remarks, you used a word, disincentivization. Can you amplify on that a little bit in terms of how you think, what you mean by that in the context of your role as a writer-producer working in the business?
Sure. You know, it's all heady, but let's reduce it to one program and show how it works, right? Corner Gas, a program that was one of the greatest comedies that this country's ever produced. Million and a half viewers the entire length of that run. The truth is that Corner Gas was moved something like 6 or 7 times by CTV, and this is from a company that actually liked Corner Gas. But there's a lot of problems with Corner Gas, because every year they could buy a US show, and they would plug it in, they would move Corner Gas. Corner Gas's audience would find it because it wanted to watch Corner Gas, and the US comedy that took its place would usually not make it to a second season, would be lower rated, but they still made more money on that comedy, partly because they discount the advertising rates on Canadian programs. That's a dirty little secret that is true, but nobody talks about. And part of it has to do with the fact that so long as we are geared, the traditional broadcast networks are geared toward this idea of being able to simultaneously substitute all the time, Canadian television will always be an afterthought. We will not be able to build serialization or audiences. People will not know when to find us. Any marketing problems we have will be exacerbated. It disincentivizes you to promote your Canadian TV because that's not where you're making your money. You're making your money off the rental of US content, which is a fundamentally last century business model. You know, in the States, business models are changing. As I said, cable channels that were once, 8 years ago, nobody would have guessed that AMC and Starz would be doing original content. They are doing that not because suddenly they all got ambitious. They're doing that because they saw the writing on the wall and said, oh shit, if we don't do this, we go away. That is very late to come here. There's a lot of people that are trying to scrabble for the last little bit of protecting their old silo way of thinking rather than moving forward into the new future. And unfortunately, the CRTC, though an imperfect instrument, is the instrument that's going to have to sort of push a little bit of that stuff going forward, while encouraging some of the new systems to come up. You know, really, at the end of the day, I'm not worried for my future. I know I'll be able to finish off my future. I'm good at what I do. I'll get paid what I do. The only question is, you know, am I going to be doing it, and is my money going to be going to Canadian and going to Revenue Canada, or am I going to be paying the IRS? That's the issue, and it's the issue for a lot of people here. I go home next week, and I'm working with Mark Ellis and Stephanie Morgenstern on their new show. They are committed to staying in Canada. Of course, they can be, because they made, you know, not a ton of money off Flashpoint, but they did pretty well. This is what we need to do. We need to keep our talent here, and we need to find new ways to, you know, to make us less desperate. Because the other thing that we do is you know, we decide that, oh, we've got to be as generic as possible. And you look at things like The Killing, the original Killing, the Israeli series that get picked up. You know, at some point we need to get to the point, the CRTC needs to ask the question, why are everyone else's formats being bought and Canadian formats aren't being bought so much? We have to be able to be free to make stuff that is specific and interesting and sell that. We can do it. I know smart producers. I know smart writers that are ready to do it. But we need the space to be able to do it rather than have to go down to LA and, you know, and ply our wares there.
Gary?
Well, just like in response to that, I was just, how you know, we talk about CTV and them buying up foreign programs. Well, I worked on a show called Cold Squad for many years. Brilliant Canadian original, wonderful show. Okay, that was CTV's top ranking show. And at the top of our ranking, after 10 years and 100 shows, or 8 years and 100 shows, they canceled the show. And what did they buy? They bought Cold Case, an American show that was an exact copy of Cold Squad, with the exact same format, almost to the exact same opening credits and the exact same theme music. And they got sued. And we won. Well, the show won against Bruckheimer, or whatever his name is. But the thing is how can you go to CTV and you say, well, you're a sack of crap, you are. You canceled a top-rated show and bought an exact copy from the U.S. But when you look at it from a businessman's point of view, they have a fiscal responsibility to their shareholders and to keep the company going. So they buy Cold Case as a foreign sale for $100 and something thousand a show, and they buy Cold Squad at $800,000 or $900,000 a show, and they go, oh, wait a minute, so it costs $800,000 or $900,000 to produce Cold Squad. Well, I can get the exact same show from the U.S. for $100,000. How do we compete against that model? And that's the thing, is it doesn't matter how successful a program is here in Canada. If somebody copies it in the U.S. or in Britain, they're going to take that show from the U.S. because it's cheaper. So it's fiscally responsible. It's ethically horrible, but fiscally responsible for them to do that. And how do we get around that? And how do we change the model in order to get the revenue to make Canadian film production sustainable? That's my big question.
Moyra?
You know, I think one thing that I'm hearing in the room, and that I certainly feel myself, is that the CRTC, I think, would be wise to acknowledge it, is there is a lot of distrust and there's a lot of baggage between content creators and broadcasters in this country. Because while the going was good and the broadcasters had, you know, they were at a buffet, and us peons could come and offer our dinner, and if they didn't like our plate, they could go to the next one, and there was a line 1,000 deep behind us offering our wares. And you know, many of us have been very lucky and done really well being able to sell different shows, but there is this sort of distrust and tension that I think exists. And again, we need some kind of leadership. And I'm encouraged, again, about Jean-Pierre Blais, because I think that he might be the person to do it. I'm not even positive it's the CRTC is the right entity to do it, but I'm not sure we've got anything else, frankly. But it's back to this theme of leadership. Like, I think we need to sort of I don't know that you can kind of heal those wounds, but we got to place our trust in someone. And I think there's got to be this balance between working together with a regulator that, as Heather said, can protect us. But I also think it's incumbent upon us as business people, as content creators, to also be more entrepreneurial. Because yes, the web series right now, some of them, even though they're small, are doing well. In fact, a lot of them are doing well and making money. But I think we've got to get out of, we've got to kind of shed the past too and get more into just a sort of a positive and entrepreneurial, business-based outlook. And we've never been better positioned to do that, because as content creators, we have access to the audience. We've never had access to the audience before. We couldn't even, I couldn't even get ratings for some of my shows with broadcasters where I had great relationships. And you just, you hope to hell that you did well. And I guess you do, because you get asked to do another, I guess your show did okay because you get asked to do another one. But, we can find out about the audience. That's what Magnify Digital is all about. It's arming content creators with the tools and services to help them identify their audiences and figure out how to monetize and build those strategies. So I guess in that sort of rambling that covered a lot of terrain, what I'm saying is that again, we need leadership, we need to overcome the past, and we need, as content creators, to be supported, I suppose, by an entity that will enable us and encourage us to be entrepreneurial and to embrace some of these new opportunities. I don't think television is going to be dead. I think it's going to look very different. But no matter how you slice it, I think we are going to have to act more like a normal business, and content creators, more like business people. Whether you create the space for writers and producers to be purely artistic and to be driven by pure content and creation, we've got to act a bit more like regular businesses and stop relying so much on funding and some of those old models that kind of worked in the past in a very old paradigm.
I confess I love television. And I've developed a bit of arthritis in my thumb from the remote. And I was flipping channels last night, picking up on a point that Jamie mentioned around this notion of the current system disincentivizes, or can, and sometimes appear to be disincentivizing production. And I was flipping channels and I saw this promo, and it was Arctic Air coming on new shows on a new night. And I went, a new night. Good thing, bad thing. Who are you?
I'm Brian Hamilton. I'm one of the partners of Omni Film Entertainment, and we make Arctic Air. As Dennis alluded to, and also Garry, when you
Dennis, I'm sorry.
When as a producer, when your network moves your show, it's never a good thing because your audiences have to find it again. But I think these days, many of us are really unaware of when a show actually airs because we watch it off our PVR anyway. Most of my favorite shows, I couldn't tell you what their scheduled time is, and that's, and I'm in my 50s, so anyone younger than me is even more tending that way. So I would say that's less of a challenge now. We as producers are always confronted by how can we reach our audiences better, and obviously promotion is part of it. And I hear a lot of comments about if only the CRTC could do this or that, and I agree that there aren't that many other agencies out there that we're looking for help from. But for our company, it's a paradox, because when people say, well, if only there were more Canadian buyers, or if our Canadian networks were doing more commissioning of original programming, I mean, ironically, the regulatory system has created a sense at these networks that Canadian programming is more an obligation than an opportunity. It's this sense that it's a cost of doing business. And we want to get away from that. As content makers, we want to get away from that. And yet, ironically, it's the regulations that are creating that. So if we ask the CRTC to do more regulatory intervention, then in a way, it's going the wrong direction. And certainly a theme here that I would support is that the Canadian networks, and maybe Netflix is American, but there hopefully will be a Canadian Netflix one day. And so I'm not just thinking of the traditional broadcasters, but Canadian broadcasters will need to change their business model to have more unique offerings, because the rental of American programming is not a sustainable business. And so when I go to meet with buyers, I do a lot of travel to Hollywood. I do a lot of travel to Toronto. One of the differences is when I'm in Los Angeles, people are looking for their next hit. They're looking for their next way of breaking out. Sometimes in Toronto, when I'm speaking to people, I feel that they are looking for a reason to not have to commission this. In a way, it's more of a defensive posture. I mean, one thing that was interesting for me is in the 2008 recession, when in both countries money dried up and people were under stress. In Canada, all the broadcasters basically stopped commissioning most of their content. They rolled up the red carpet and they rebroadcast programs they already had in their inventory. When I saw the same economic situation in the US, I saw people rolling the dice more, basically going out and saying, what do you have? Now I really need it, There was a cultural disconnect there. And I'm often fighting the perception down there that Canadians are so dependent on our funding system and our incentives that we are not as entrepreneurial. Even our company, we have so many people on our business affairs and accounting side to deal with all the requirements of the different funding. It's that in itself can be a trap, because we find ourselves as producers sometimes making programs that suit the funding parameters instead of just imagining what could be the most popular program that anyone would ever want to watch. And for our development has changed over the last few years, where now we kind of close our eyes to what happens to be eligible for funding, and we just imagine what people might want to watch, and we try and target more niche audiences. But instead of making the best Canadian program, we try and make the best program in the world. And I'm sure everyone has that same desire, but it does go right through our development culture now.
Can you make the best program in the world in Canada?
I truly believe we can. I don't think that there are any. First of all, there's no rule that says you have to qualify for Canadian funding to make shows, right? But for example, Muse, a Montreal company, made a biopic of the Kennedys. Now one would say, well, that's not particularly Canadian, but it actually did qualify for CRTC certification. So the CRTC's constraints are actually much looser than the CMF, much looser than CAVCO. So already the CRTC is doing a fair amount in terms of opening the door to programming that may or may not be set in Canada, may or may not be about identifiably Canadian themes.
Do you see that CRTC, CMF, telefilm, where you've identified that the definition of Canadianness or Canadian is different at these different institutions? Is that do you see that as being an opportunity, or is that a problem? Does it enable you to go into one door with this type of program and another door with another type of program, or would you be you know, would you be seeking in the future to see more consistency across the board where those qualifying criteria, if you want to call them that, are aligned more?
Well, I think the current system makes some sense in this way. The more Canadian you are, the more Canadian financing you can attract. So if you happen to have all Canadian creative people and on-screen talent, then you're eligible for the CMF. If you have considerably less, then you don't qualify for CMF money, but you still do get an enhanced license fee from the Canadian network, and you're still eligible for certain levels of tax credits. So overall, I think the system makes sense. I mean, I, of course, as a producer, would prefer more flexibility, but this is not a CMF conversation. This is a CRTC conversation. You know, I feel the CRTC is already relatively flexible.
Jackson.
Yeah, Jackson Davies. I'm an actor, writer, producer. I just want to change gears, if it's possible, to say how let's take a look at how we can change all this. Now, this may be totally out of left field. We know that the private broadcasters really don't want to do Canadian. They're forced to do it, I would think. So why not take the money that they should be paying for producing Canadian shows, pool that money, and fund one network really well? I mean, at 600 channels, I can go to a sports channel. I know I'm going to get sports. We should be able to go to one out of those 600 or 700 channels to go, I'm going to watch Canadian tonight. I'm going to go to that site, and that's going to be all Canadian broadcast. And I mean broadcasting that is where the licensing fees can make it relevant. And yet also that this Canadian superstation, maybe it's CBC, maybe it isn't, also has a .ca component or .com where it's a broadcaster for Canadian content to the world. Pay the licensing fees enough that you could be paid properly for your show, and then you would have this one network where people from all around the world can go and view Canadian shows. And as well as a Canadian broadcaster and the rest of those other networks, that's fine. I believe, like you, they're one mouse click away from being irrelevant. Once that tipping point comes from the American shows come in, you know, they're in trouble. But if we could find and fund one network with Canadian, and I have to admit I'm a fan of scripted drama, and fund it so you would be able to turn on a show and not just have 13 episodes or 9 episodes, being able to get 23 or 24 so your audience isn't disappeared. We have an advantage now with CBC losing Hockey Night in Canada. That's going to free up all that time in the spring that they were showing the playoffs. So, you know, Canadian shows would be on the air for 13 weeks and then off the air for another 30 weeks or whatever. And it's hard to build up that audience again. That way we could have, the shows would have a bigger pickup and we'd be able to get an audience that could buy into them. I don't know. Thought.
Catherine, is your world more entrepreneurial than the traditional television world that...
It should be. It's not yet, but it should be. I mean, we think in terms of the type of people that we're looking forward to. I mean, even my staff are all in their 20s. They binge view. I binge view. I love sitting down and watching, you know, a full series in 2 nights. So 13 weeks means nothing to me. So, you know, the idea of a super channel, but having it internet-based is more appealing to me than a super channel on a regular TV network. So I like the idea of coming to a great Canadian show. I mean, we worked in the early days in the first interactive on intelligence with Haddock Entertainment, which I thought personally was one of the finest dramas ever. And the fact that, you know, we still from that website get emails from people saying, where's the show gone? Why doesn't it come back? Can you get me in touch with the people there? It would have been a fantastic homeland or something that could have been both digital and had a huge digital and traditional network broadcast play. It should have been a show that truly was a transmedia show in its very being, and it got sliced and diced one Easter And it was a black day for us all because we saw the potential of a show like that and what it should have been. And as a digital person, it was the most exciting show to work on because you could see all the spin-offs and all the ways to involve and engage audience. And we were getting emails that audience wanted that show. And the emails were coming in saying, where did that show go? And nobody cared. So there's such a lovely idea of this patchwork of platforms coming together, but I agree with Moyra so wholeheartedly that it needs leadership to acknowledge that those platforms need to be looked at as a jigsaw puzzle or a mosaic. It's not all in one and some of the other. It's just they can work together. And honestly, some shows do not need digital components. And I know we're talking CRTC, not CMF, but some shows do not need us as creators on the digital side to go and create these big digital ARGs or something like that. It just doesn't make sense. So the funding mechanisms on the non-CRTC side have to change too, so that the dollars are allocated where they really should be allocated, which is great content independent of what screen you put it on. And you don't make people do things and spend $1 million on an ARG for a show that doesn't deserve an augmented reality game. So I think that acknowledging that and trying to work where the audience is identified right up front as to who they are, what do they do, how do they act, where do you access them, and then content creators take that knowledge and find the platforms to take that show out. And as content creators, that's super exciting because if you know where the audience is and you know where they hang out, you can start building the platforms around that knowledge.
A couple of comments over here. Both of you used the word protected. You know, we need to be protected. I'm just curious to know how you, and maybe you don't need to square this circle, but how do you square the circle between feeling that need to be protected and the desire to be more entrepreneurial within the system?
Sure, first off, it scares me that I said the word protected. It's really not who I am. So let me try that again. Yeah, it's funny because I would be on the outside looking in. I would be somebody that would totally say, because I am an entrepreneur, I am a creator as well as a businesswoman, and I think what I'm trying to say is that I think Canadian stories are important and they're important to be told, and I think everybody here is going to agree with that. I think that we call it television, but it's broadcast on many different screens. I think everybody here agrees with that. I think that I don't have a problem with calling it television and making it available on a cell. I think that's fabulous. I watch most of my shows on my iPad. So it is a matter of really just how do we make sure that we can have Canadian stories being told? How do we make sure that broadcasters, and I'm not giving up my cable because I get money from the cable company, and I figure I should pay into what is paying me to do shows. That being said, my kids will never pay into it. So it is a matter of we have to figure out different ways of doing it. When I say protected, hopefully what I mean is, how can we, I used to hate the CRTC. I used to think that it wasn't something that helped us at all until I sort of grew up in the industry. And then I understood that, you know, what they're trying to do, and they have, in my opinion, had a history of sort of ups and downs. But what they're trying to do is make sure that these Canadian stories can be told by Canadian content producers. That's what I think we want to encourage all the way along. And I think that it's important that, I mean, obviously for someone to pay us to make content, they have to get paid. So that's all it is a matter of trying to figure out how do people get paid for programming on different platforms, and how are they encouraged to use Canadians to do their programming. I'm all with Brian. We want to do the best programs in the world, period. You know, I remember back when I first started in TV, it was like, ooh, you've got a local show, that's awesome. And then it was like, ooh, you've got a national show, that's exciting. And now it's like nobody would do a show unless you're sure that it can travel. So it's a matter of how do we take these stories and how do we make sure that there's enough money coming in and going out of the system that we are encouraged to keep telling Canadian stories and to keep paying Canadians to make stories and make great stories, but have the Canadians tell them.
So there was one statement in your in your eloquent
Rant?
you said that I'm just sort of testing this in terms of the room, that what the CRTC is there for, and if I get it wrong, correct me, but to paraphrase, the CRTC's role is to encourage the telling of Canadian stories for Canadian audiences.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know, because I agree with Brian too a little bit, and Garry a bit on when you talk about Canadian stories, because like, you know, is Continuum a Canadian story? Is Orphan Black a Canadian story? Those are great stories.
Yeah.
Those are great stories. I think that's what we want to encourage, is the telling of great stories by Canadians for everybody.
And if you were, is that a shared sentiment in the room?
We got to break out of the broken.
Yeah. Over here.
I'm Rob LaBelle. I'm an actor and I'm an executive producer of Motive. And I mean, to riff off of that, I think that is really the notion is, I don't think it's a misnomer to say Canadians telling Canadian stories to Canadians at all. It's going back to what everybody's saying. You want to have Canadians telling dynamic, vital, entertaining stories to the world. And that has to be a way to encourage that to continue to happen within Canada, because, as Denis was saying, you know, the talent will migrate where there's available work and will go down south. And I think worked into the system in some way is the economies of scale. There's so few broadcasters, there's so few funding organizations that are on the business side of things, that it limits the kinds of avenues and stories that we're able to tell to be able to get out. And I think that one of the results of that is that there's fewer serialized stories that are able to be told because of the expense for advertising, for the continuity and consistency of the evening that it does air, even though people watch it on various formats. I mean, Orphan Black is a great example of something that's really succeeded that way. Intelligence was ongoing stories, Continuum as well, which, you know, has heavy serialized elements. But all of those are dynamic, great shows that work internationally, and that's what I think we have to be able to encourage among ourselves, so that it becomes. I always think of like the golden age of Australian cinema. You know, that wasn't Australians telling Australian stories for Australians. That was Australians telling great fucking story to the world. And that's what you need to do, and that's the bottom line, I think, is about entertainment. And then, of course, to be able to make money doing that. And that will come with support within the industry in Canada, both the broadcast and regulatory industry, who do have a desire to be great. And I think that that's a problem because of those issues of renting American shows and forced to have to fund things and all of that, is we're doing it because we have to, as opposed to thinking, this is great. We do have those storytellers here, and we have to be able to do that. And so that's where I think there's a limitation. There's not the desire to be like the BBC, and I'm not specifically thinking of the CBC, but the BBC, which is known throughout the world as quality drama. They're not thinking, how do I make a show that hits women between 25 and 55 and hits every province and blah, 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 and waters it down. They're looking to have great dynamic creators do stuff, and the audience will follow.
Moyra, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said, but there's another type of Canadian show that I've had experience with that is about producing absolutely the best Canadian story possible for Canadians that doesn't necessarily travel, and didn't travel 5-10 years ago when there were less outlets to sell to. And those are the kind of stories. I think of one in particular that we did. It was a biography on Brian Orser, the Olympic figure skater. And that story was a very important story, I believe, to tell in Canada. It was an unknown story. It was a tell-all. And it would not have been made were it not for the CBC and the CMF. And I mean, we won awards for it. I think it was a good story, but could it travel? No, because it would then became an acquisition, and in selling it to international companies, there was a lot of demand for it in Korea. There wasn't enough money to clear the rights beyond Canada, the music rights and the very, very expensive Olympic footage, the IOC footage and the World Figure Skating. And I've been involved with a few of those kinds of shows because I have produced a lot for the CBC. A lot of them have had to do with music and music rights. And it's that there is a middle ground. And when I talk about protection, it's protecting those types of stories that sometimes they're quiet Canadian stories that don't have a huge international market, but nonetheless are, I think, very, very important stories to be made and told to Canadians. And so I do think that there's a middle ground between the, it's got to be a great Canadian story and we should be able to sell it internationally, to Canadian stories that are just so kind of homely and no one's going to buy them. I do think there's a middle ground, and that's certainly what I've experienced.
So then the message that, the word that keeps coming up here in terms of the CRTC and looking to the future is flexibility seems to be a very big part of that for you to some extent. Denis.
A couple of people cringed at the word protection, which I thought was funny. I cringed a little bit at the word entrepreneurial because nobody in the Canadian system is entrepreneurial. Not really. The CBC gets government money. Canadian private networks build their business off U.S. programming and a regulatory rule that allows them to do that. We get government funding. When you start applying things like entrepreneurial, that tends to me to be a dog whistle word that is going to result in shuffling the deck in such a way that, usually what happens is the big companies will figure out a way to not have to do things they don't want to do, and will continue the long, slow slide into obscurity. The CRTC, my dad raised me with always saying, what are your rights and what are your responsibilities? And I sometimes think that a different approach to any CRTC hearing thing would be good if somebody they got them down there and said, all right, what are the things you want? What are the rights that you think you have? Broadcasters, BDUs, producers, writers. All right, what are your responsibilities now? What is the responsibility of you as a member of the Canadian Broadcasting System to deliver? And the third question is, what can you do that nobody else can do? What is the unique thing that you are offering? Here's the first time this is mentioned in discussion: the consumer, the audience. What can you give them that nobody else is giving them? What can CTV, what can CBC, what can Moyra, what can I give the consumer that they can't get from somewhere else? How do you make that happen? I think the CRTC can't get out of the business of regulation, but maybe what we're looking for is probably lighter regulation, but right regulation. The regulation that allows, and it's a fine line to walk, because it was easy when it was 4 channels. It was not so easy when it was 35 channels. Now it's an iPad and the girl on her cell phone, and somebody's gonna be watching it on the chip in their brain, and it's all that sort of stuff. And it's a difficult road to walk. So yes, flexibility is going to be important. But at the same time, too, let's focus on our side of the ledger. You can, as a CRTC, look at this and ask us questions about this, but we need to look at things like Orphan Black. Why is that one of Time's 10 best shows of the year? Continuum. We have a huge, I am freaked out by my Twitter followers have gone up 30% in the last 3 months because they know I'm working on Continuum. That's amazing. A show, by the way, that doesn't get CMF funding, but is set in Vancouver. So, there you go. There are shows that do well with critics that maybe don't do audiences. There are the shows that Moyra is talking about that are actually small, lovely little Canadian stories that now actually do have a chance to export, finally, because the world is watching weird things. I went to South Africa on a show in 2004, and I watched South African TV. And I saw some crazy youth soap operas that actually taught me about South Africa. There's an element of that that's involved too, that's non-quantifiable. You go, and there are people around the world that kind of instinctively understand that Flashpoint is different because its view of policing is different than the shoot first, ask questions later policing that you see in the States. As long as we are able to have the power creatively to tell those stories, John Fawcett, Graham Manson, and the people at Temple Street are allowed to tell the story they want to tell. And that is why it is good. It's not always going to be good that way, but that's why. So how can the CRTC get to that point and allow more of us to tell good stories and get them out to Canadians and have value added so that they are actually getting something for the money they pay in taxes anyway into the system. It's not necessarily entrepreneurialism, it's value for the money. And that is maybe what should guide this sort of stuff.
Please introduce yourself.
I am, my name's Jay Jolly. I'm the CEO and founder of Cineku. And I'm an entrepreneur. So 95% of our money came from private to basically launch. I'm not sure if you guys know what Cineku is, but we're soon doing it for TV pilots. So in a very short amount of time, we were able to, find talent in this country and fund our first movie, which we did for 1.6 and just wrapped 2 weeks ago in Moose Jaw, in a province that doesn't have any tax credits. So we actually, there's always a lot of talk. Like, I guess the point is like we're all talking about a problem that exists today. Where really we have to be like Wayne Gretzky. We have to play the puck where it is 3 years from now. We have to innovate a lot faster. I don't think, I love the CMF and telefilm, but we haven't been able to get any money. We actually don't fit into that system. I don't believe the CRTC can move fast enough because we're in an exponential rate of change. And you do have to, I own my own audience. I built my own platform. The social web is a broadcast medium. We had the pleasure of sponsoring Vince Gilligan to come up, and I was the sponsor on it. 2 episodes before, or 2 days before the last episode of Breaking Bad. And even he will agree if you sit down with him. If it wasn't for Netflix, Breaking Bad wouldn't be the success it is. It was those 2 episodes that people binge watched on Netflix that Hockey Stick season 3. So, my big thing is you need to move fast and you need to get a lot more private money and build business models that are sustainable, or we're dead in the water.
Well,
and quite frankly, in terms of the content, I totally agree. I don't make Canadian movies for an international audience. I make international movies that just happen to be made by Canadians. Our first movie's called Wolf Cop, Dirty Harry, Only Harrier. And it built a huge international audience.
Could you repeat that? That Dirty Harry, Only Harrier? Is that?
Yeah, and it was built. It's three people from Regina and Moose Jaw in a place you'd never think that a movie could be made in this day and age, but they killed it internationally. They had fan art coming from South Africa. They had, they sold 200 T-shirts. They did amazing stuff as filmmaker entrepreneurs, and that's what we were setting out to find. For me, we can always talk about the past, and we've made a lot of great content and a lot of great stuff, but you really need to look at the fact there's no gatekeepers. You don't have to ask permission anymore. You can own your audience, and you can actually create multiple streams of revenue if you leverage all of these big platforms and the stuff that's out there. And that's what we did. And half of our money comes from private tech investors, and some of them from very brave content producers who have made money and don't mind putting skin in the game, which a lot of people don't do. And I think, if I were to tell the CRTC anything, it's, they got a lead follower, just get the hell out of the way. Because it's like a guy like me I don't have to prescribe to anything. I can just go around everybody, because that's the world we live in now. And I think anybody in this room, I think you really, really, really need to look at a better business model than relying on something like the CMF, which is going to get less and less money as more and more people cut cable and start doing that kind of stuff. But that's just my opinion. And yes, we are going to do Teleku, but again, we can't find right now a brave broadcaster that can move fast enough for the speed that we want to travel. So it's not going to probably be in Canada. It'll probably be in Brazil, unfortunately. Anyway, thanks.
But when where do you see looking to the future? Because I think it's an interesting. Your characterization of where you're at is an interesting one. Where do you see yourself 3 years from now, 5 years from now? Do you have a business plan that carries you out that far?
Absolutely. And I have to, because I get the crap kicked out of me every day from my investors. So, in the future, I see us basically like we're building I believe in a concept called audience equity. So there's 5 things we wanted to do with Cineku that we believe we can do with anything. Like one was that we want to discover talent where no one else is looking. There's more talent in the flyover part of this country than there is in Vancouver or Toronto or Montreal as an aggregate. There's also incredible audience. We wanted to prove we could build an audience even before we started financing. And not only build that audience, but understand who they are, where they live, how old they are they fans, super fans, are they the whales in the casino that drive everybody else? How do we moneyball P&A and marketing strategies? How do we bring big data and create a playbook between script and screen that we can iterate on every single year moving forward? And most importantly, how do we bring private financing back into Canadian content? So again, we're not about making we're not here to hit a home run. We're here to make sure that we get on base every year. And you have to be brave, and you have to move fast, and you have to spend little bits of money. Like you can do a lot of damage with $500,000 these days, and make very good ROI that you can build upon. In terms of where I see myself, right this year we put up, for our first pilot, we put up $1 million and a guaranteed theatrical. I'd like to think down the line that basically, we can do theatricals in Canada, we can do date and date everywhere else. Basically, I can go straight to, like we are now, like going straight to an aggregator like a Gravitas or a Film Buff, or we can just go straight do a direct deal for exclusive content, because that's where the arms race is going to be in the future for a Netflix, is being able to get that exclusive content and having a very quick pipeline that can deliver it to maintain that social contract with the audience that you're building through that process. Because for us, one of the things everybody looked at Cineku is you got to realize what we're really doing is we're telling the stories about filmmakers. Like we had 92 teams from across Canada that basically came into our film accelerator, and really it was the Cinderella story of those 3 girls from Brandon, Manitoba making it to the big screen more than it is the content at the end of the day. So it does, and it's kind of one of those things like I like to say about when you look at the DNA of our country. Like it's one of the amazing things about Hockey Night in Canada. Remember, Hockey Night in Canada is about telling the stories of the players on the ice more than it is about the statistics around it. And our big thing was we believed we could turn filmmakers, not only instill them with an entrepreneurial sense where they were not only creatively well-rounded, but they also understood how to market themselves and their content very early, which most people don't know how to do, and that they have a little bit of business acumen you could build a long tail off of. And in our system, it's a very tough love system. It's not a film school, it's not remedial. It's like where I came out of, like RoLab, which was a tech accelerator. Like you put people under pressure to deliver, and if they're good, you capitalize them at the end. So, and that's one thing the CMF is just not set up to do, bless their heart. It's one thing Telefilm's not set up to do. It's too slow. Like most of the stuff we're talking about now, we're not going to see for 2 years. That's too late. That's my opinion. But I believe that for Cineku, where we want to build our brand and what we see ourselves like, we're going to get to the point where we're going to be able to, within 10 months, turn around movies, get them out on the platforms, maintain the audience, and Cineku will become more like where we version from a phone right to a theater. And that there's that expectation. It's almost like a subscription. It's almost, you could call it a graphic novelty type model, where you can rent it for 99 cents, or you can own it for $4.99. Pricing models are going to change, like all of these things. And quite frankly, I don't know. 3 years is that's a hard outlook. It's really, really tough with how things change and the speed they change. I believe you have to be agile, and you need to learn how to fail fast too, and pivot. But anyway.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Stewart. I'm a writer. I just wanted to pick up on declining cable revenues, and also about the internet not having gatekeepers, because I think there is a gatekeeper, the internet providers, who are also the cable companies, right? I mean, I think we need to look at these companies not as broadcasters or BDUs or as internet providers, but as these screen providers who are Bell and Rogers and Shaw. And as I think the CMF model, in fact, has served Canadian television very well, and as those revenues decline to the CMF from the BDUs, I think they should be picked up by the internet aspect of those same companies.
CRTC is not going to move fast enough to get the Netflix involved. I don't see that happening, personally. I don't know how they're going to do it.
We've just got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to go here, and then we'll just do a quick wrap.
I think it's, first of all, obviously, it's something that CRTC does not have control over, but one of their strongest recommendations needs to be to the government to go back and rewrite the Broadcast Act, because the Broadcast Act is ridiculous. Everything that we've talked about today didn't exist when that last Broadcast Act was written. It's, we're dealing with an imperfect instrument. Government regulation is slow. Sineku, things like that, Project Greenlight before it, those are part of the equation. Netflix is part of the equation. Every once in a while we read an article about, thinking about launching a Canadian Netflix. The Canadian Netflix is Netflix, and all that sort of stuff, it's out there. What we need to do, what I do in things like this, and because it's so important in television, let's go to a sports metaphor. You get a baseball player, he gets up to the plate, and his job, as it is my job as a writer, is to fail most of the time. It is an incredibly risky proposition telling stories. Most of what you do will fail. The US, who are better at it than anybody, 90% of their shows fail. But you know what the trick is? The trick is, if you get a guy that has a 300 average, which means that 7 times out of 10 at the plate, he fails. That person makes millions and millions and millions of dollars a year. The secret is, how do you incentivize the system so that the people in this room get swings at the plate, and enough of them that they can make the Orphan Blacks, that they can make, I wish you luck on your first film, Wolf Cops, that they can make, continuums that target macro and micro audiences, that target audiences that are homegrown and audiences that speak to the world, that are filler on U.S. networks in the summer because it's cheap, and are feted on the carpet at Cannes because nobody can believe how great Tatiana Maslany is. We can do all of these things. The secret is, how do we get the swings in? How do you help us to get the swings in?
So as a producer who's just coming out of EFS, so I'm a newbie. But one of the biggest pieces of advice I keep getting is to be a producer, to go to LA so I have credibility in Canada, is one of the biggest things I keep hearing. They're like, you have to spend time in LA so that you can come up here and get Canadian funding. They're like, if you want to be a Canadian producer and create Canadian content, which I proudly wear the Eye on Canada thing, they're like, you need credibility in LA. And I think that is a fundamental, huge problem for the newest Canadian producers, because at a school like Vancouver Film School, you have all these international students, and the Canadians have to leave the country to become successful so that they can come back.
But that's not a problem that's exclusive to Canada. You go to Italy, you go to France, I worked with the French last year. Guess what the French are worried about? Guess what the Australians are worried about? That is every country except the United States. That's the CRTC can do absolutely nothing to fix that, except frankly, allow the more swings at the plate. I'm not the person. There's a woman named Diane Wild who runs an agriculture website, that does Canadian content, and by the way, this is the most important resource for Canadian content in Canada. It's done by a volunteer. That's an incredible thing, and it's true. But she's got a line that I love about Sci-Fi, is that the Sci-Fi channel in the States, which has the night of Canadian television that no Canadian broadcaster has. And it's true. If you look at it, Continuum, Orphan Black, and Bitten's coming on the air next year, there will be a night of the week where a U.S. channel is running more Canadian content than Canadian channels are.
To add to that, you look at the CW's recent lineup, and you have Robbie Amell, Stephen Amell, Kristen Craik, all these Canadian leads. You have How I Met Your Mother doing all these Canadian episodes where you turn in and you're like, oh my gosh, this is like amazing Canadian content, and it's coming from America, which is sort of ironic. It's being made here in Canada. Like, the CW does a lot of investments here, but like I talked about to my school, and I talked to recruiters, and I went to networking events to try to meet anybody from the producing room in the CW, and I was told they're all down in LA making the Canadian content. They're filming up here, but still, to succeed as a producer, to work on one of those productions here in Canada, the biggest advice I keep getting is still to go to LA so that I can work on Canadian productions. And as we have this evolution of TV, not death of TV, as I sort of brought up earlier, as we have more original content coming from digital portals, or as I would say, I watched maybe one episode of Continuum on TV. The rest was all on the Showcase web portal. So we're at this point where TV and web series are they're becoming the same. You have hour-long web series that are the same production quality as TV. You have Halo Forward Unto Dawn, which got more funding than most television series, and Spielberg is doing the Halo series. So you have this point where television is becoming more about the content rather than the platform. And I think moving forward, it would be very nice to see more incentivization of Canadian content on whichever platform, because we're reaching a point of convergence of the different mediums where storytelling and bringing the Canadian stories is getting more and more important. And I want to personally thank you for Continuum, because that was amazing seeing it unveiled at Fan Expo and going, Primeval in Vancouver, Continuum in Vancouver, and just being a Vancouverite and being from BC and going, holy crap, Canada's competitive now. We're actually having Canadian content, and it would be really good to see the CRTC incentivizing more of that, so that going forward we see more Canadian content, more flashpoints, more continuums. And honestly, the CW is doing a great job right now in promoting Canadian actors. It would be nice to see the CRTC promoting more of that.
Ultimately, regulation is always about carrots and sticks, right? We need new sticks because the carrots are different. That's what it comes down to.
One final comment up here, and then we're going to wrap it up.
I'm Angèle Beausoleil, one of the francophones here, I guess. I'm also a creative entrepreneur and also an intrapreneur, so I've worked within corporations as well as on my own to innovate. And I'm now in corporate sabbatical, and I'm working on a PhD. I'm obsessed with BC's creative economy, and I'm focusing the next 3 years on helping build it. So I'm very happy to have been invited to be here. And I want to build off of what Jackson said in terms of new models. So I am an interdisciplinary student, so I look at the future in terms of computer technology, cognitive science, on how audiences behave, respond to content, as well as the business school, and as well as sociology, to really understand sociocultural and economic lens. And I wanted to actually question in terms of the incentivization concept here, and build on Jackson's in terms of future models, is that what is the role of CRTC? Is it to incentivize, or is it to enable? So I have a big question around that, because if through regulation, through the different mechanisms in which it provides for our country, what is its real role in terms of enabling and building the ecologies and the ecosystems we need to innovate, we need to fail? And I would love to continue this conversation, because I think there are some phenomenal models, many of which, and maybe because I am French-Canadian and I'm a 28-year Vancouverite, that there is a fantastic model that we often forget called Cirque du Soleil. That is a content model. It's just, we forget that we need to look outside of our own sector, whether it's TV, film, digital media, and go, what's a model we can look at? Phenomenal incentive to begin with, great cultural investment, and it's paid back in dividends. And so I'm a huge advocate of looking outside our sector, looking at new models, and planning ahead.
I'm currently reading a great book. It's written by David Byrne, the Talking Heads guy, whom people my age know about. It's called How Music Works, and I was reading it the other night, and I caught one little sentence. He said, in 2009, of the 97,000 plus albums that were released, there were 5,000 that sold more than 5,000 units. So huge content being created, but the successes in terms of sales quite limited. And I'm always struck by that in terms of the in terms of the guy at the plate that's hitting 300. Don't be afraid of the CRTC. I can speak from personal experience, having appeared before the CRTC. It can be quite an intimidating forum, but nonetheless, you know, don't be afraid of it. I think it's really important to speak up and ensure that your voices are heard there. So thanks to everybody for participating in this session this morning, and I hope that you all found it to be a worthwhile and constructive conversation.